Bialino Chime, Easter here. I'm going to be covering lesson 8 today in the series of Introduction to Nahuatl. Today I'm going to be discussing Classical Nahuatl, and I'm going to be specifically discussing why it's not the original Nahuatl. Okay, a lot of people believe that Classical Nahuatl is the gold standard of Nahuatl, like it was the original, right? It was the best, and then all the other Nahuatl variants are somehow inferior. This is a very widespread belief. Okay, maybe you've encountered it before, but it's one of those beliefs that Nahuatl speakers really hate because obviously it's very problematic, right? It devalues their variants. It centers the Mexica, who are the people who were the focus of classical Nahuatl, right? And it just causes so many problems. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just kind of show you what classical Nahuatl actually looked like, and grammatically speaking and linguistically speaking, it was actually not it was not a very good written version of Nahuatl. Okay, the Spaniards from the 16th century, they they wrote it in a way that was not as intuitive as it could be, and as a result, anybody who has never read classical Nahuatl before, if you try, even if you understand a modern Nahuatl variant, it'll be really difficult because of the way the Spaniards decided to write it. So, in this lesson, my argument is that first of all, classical Nahuatl is not the original Nahuatl, and second of all, it was it was a very poor written version of Nahuatl to begin with. Okay, and it's unfortunate because it's impacted a lot of our knowledge of Nahuatl today. And so, to break it down, let's think about it for a minute. The Spaniards came into Mexico Tenochtitlan, right, in the 1500s, and after the wars with the Mexica, right, they overtook Mexico Tenochtitlan. They colonized Mexico Tenochtitlan, and then they started to document the culture, right, with the intended goal of converting the people. Okay, well, if we think about just how large the Mexica Empire was at that point, it was extremely widespread, and so Nahuatl was actually spoken not only in Mexico Tenochtitlan, but in nearby cities such as Texcoco, Tlacopan, also Tlaxcala, and so Chalco también. And so since it was spoken by neighboring groups, well, those were what we call variants, right? Like they did not speak the exact same Nahuatl as the Mexica, and so that's something that a lot of people are not aware of, and that's really really important to note. Okay, and then you have Nahuatl was spoken all the way to in the modern state of Veracruz, all the way to El Salvador, right? And so if you think about it, all of those people were speaking Nahuatl at the same time. Now, they did not all speak the same type of Nahuatl because they were not all from Mexico Tenochtitlan. It's kind of like, if you think about it, like in England, right? In England, they speak English, but the words are not always written the same as American English. They are pronounced very differently, right? Uh, they're spelled differently. So there's so many differences, and sometimes even words have completely different meanings, right? And so you'll have a situation where you say an American English phrase, and the British will be completely confused because they don't use the words in the same way, or they use completely different words. And so that's an example of what it was like back then and is still today. A lot of people get so frustrated. They say, why are there so many Nahuatl variants? Why can't it just be standardized? Well, you can't standardize any language. English is not standardized. It's very, but by geography. And so the same thing happened to Nahuatl. Okay, so we want to avoid this thinking that this Nahuatl was the original Nahuatl that everybody spoke, because that was not the case. We're talking about a specific group of people. Okay, and then we can expect, for example, that they have different ways of pronouncing words. They had different words they used altogether, and that's still the case today. Okay, it's not like a lot of people think, that the Nahuatl somehow devolved, right? Like it was a very good type of Nahuatl, and then it devolved into what we have now, which is various variants. But that's not the case. Okay, language is always going to vary. If you go to central varieties, they might say panolti to say hello, panolti, and that's how they say it. But if you go to Veracruz, the Huasteca region, they will say piali. Okay, and so a person from a central Nahuatl region may not understand what piali means if they don't have contact with people from the Huasteca. Same thing with the Huasteca. If they don't have a lot of contact with central varieties, they're not going to know what panolti is, right? It's constructed from the same language. You can actually look at the etymology and make sense of it. But again, it's just got different meanings and different preferences. And so that's the big reason why Classical Nahuatl is not considered to be the original. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a chronology of written Nahuatl, so we can see just how bad the Classical Nahuatl was. Okay, so we're not trying to hold this up as something that is greater than anything, because it's actually deficient in a lot of ways, and I'll show you. Okay, so here it's quien gritó. Okay, so who yelled or who screamed, right? And so it's a question. Look, you can see the Spaniard here, almost. He documented it like this. Okay, that's one really annoying thing about Classical Nahuatl. The Spaniards, depending on who it was, they wrote it differently. Like, this is the same exact phrase, but these two Spaniards wrote it exactly in different ways, right? And so if we wanted to read this and say it out loud, first of all, most people would not be able to understand what the heck this is, right? This little symbol under the C, But if it's a Z, well, we have a general idea. So most people would look at this and say, okay, this is Akin Otsatsik. Okay, Akin Otsatsik. Well, here's the problem with that. You have another Spaniard, or Rincon, and then Carochi. By the way, this is the work of Richard Alexander. He also goes by Ricardo Alejandro. He's based in Mexico City. He does a lot of really great research, especially with Classical Nahuatl. And so this is his work. He published this work a couple days ago. But it's a really great comparison, because we can see that there were some Europeans in this date range that actually did write it with, accent markers. These are telling us, these macrons, these little straight lines are telling us that it's a long vowel. Okay, so similar to English, it'll be, you'll just pronounce it a little bit longer than if it was a short vowel, right? And so that was completely missing over here, right? Completely missing. And so these Europeans decided to do that. Not only that, they have a little accent marker here that is representing a very, very important sound in Nahuatl. It's called the glottal stop. The glottal stop, this is saying that there is like a sound in between the A and the T. These two steps right here are so important, okay? And all these other Classical Nahuatl versions are lacking it. And so it's a huge problem, because in that lesson I talked to you about the meaning of the word Mexico, right? And a lot of people say that it's the belly button of the moon. And I taught you in that lesson that the way that we know that it's not the belly button of the moon is because of the placement of the long vowels. And so the long vowels become really, really important when we're talking about etymology, like how words are related, what the ultimate meaning of the word is, right? Based on the history of those long vowels. And so if we don't have that, we actually lose a lot of information if we want to study etymology. So these vowels, these long vowel markings are very, very important to especially linguists. Okay, and this glottal stop marker is extremely important for anybody who wants to actually speak the language, right? And so there were two researchers, Richard Andrews and Francis Cartooten, and they made some really, really important discoveries, and they did a really, really important work where they kind of replaced this symbol with an actual H, which is more closely, it's a much closer sound, like it's more clear, like what that sounds like, right? And so if you look at this now, we know that the actual pronunciation is not akin o tsatsik, right? It's akin o tsik. Okay, so there's a H sound. So again, akin o tsik. Okay, and so that H is very, very important. It's found in so many words in Nahuatl, and so the fact that they omitted it makes it impossible to read it. Okay, so if it wasn't for these Europeans who marked the glottal stop, and also modern day Nahuatl speakers who still utilize the glottal stop, and that's what these researchers had to do. They kind of had to listen to modern day speakers in order to figure out, where the glottal stops were, and also had to study these Europeans. So now we know how it's supposed to be spoken. And then here, there's another variation, spelling variation. These two are very important because they're Nahuatl speakers saying, hey, you know what? They're taking control over the spelling of their own language, right? Because up to this point, look, it's all Europeans writing down their language, right? And so they were kind of forced to just utilize that writing system, which was not the best. And so now you have native speakers. Okay, this one replaces the H with the J because it's closer to the jota sound in Spanish, right? And they replace the Z with an S and the QU with a K. So much more straightforward. And then the Inali spelling. This is the most kind of modern kind of spelling and the most straightforward. I mean, these two are the most widely used. You're going to see these. Obviously, this one is missing the long vowels, right? They don't really care much about long vowels, but you might be wondering, does a long vowel influence how the word is spoken? And the answer is no, actually. So these long vowels are really only important when we're talking about, like I said, etymology. They really don't impact spoken Nahuatl. And I'll show you an example of that. I mean, they're still pronounced in a lot of the variants, right? But the pronunciation of the long vowels is so hard to decipher that it's easier to then just use the context of what the speaker is saying than to listen for the long vowel. And so that's kind of how native speakers do it. Okay, and so that's probably why this one doesn't have any long vowels, because what's the point, right? And I'll show you. There's a cool website that shows this distinction between the vowels. So just to kind of summarize here, we have let's see. So again, it's in faster speech, the distinction between a long vowel and a short vowel is very, very difficult to hear. Okay, and according to this website, you have the distinction is quite difficult to hear consistently, even for native speakers. Okay, and it carries a rather low functional load. For these reasons, it is not represented in the practical orthography. Practical orthography, if you want to, actually speak it, it's not represented. And so I'm going to show you a couple examples here. So this is Orizaba Nahuatl, and so you'll hear a native speaker. So we're focusing here on this word here. This has a short O right here, and then this one has a long O. Okay, so we would expect, since it's a long O, the difference would be like Oniktokak and Oniktokak, right? onictocak. So a little longer. So let's hear and see if we can, if we actually hear that.
Yalla onictocak ni toro no vecino.
One more time.
Yalla onictocak ni toro no vecino. Yalla onictocak ni toro no vecino.
All right. Now let's try the next one with the long vowel.
Yalla onictocak cacamotle.
One more time.
Yalla onictocak cacamotle.
And a third time.
Yalla onictocak cacamotle.
So as you can see, I mean, especially if you're not a fluent native speaker. Okay, so that was just an example again of why the long vowel. I mean, yes, it's very, very extremely important, right? If you're doing etymology work, linguistics work, but in speaking not so much. Okay, you would just use the context, because I mean, if there are different words, like just like in that example, right? Like they're spelled exactly the same, they have all exactly the same sounds, but they are different because one has a long vowel and the other one doesn't. And so you just have to use the context of the sentence to figure out what's going on, which is easier to do than to try to listen for the long vowel. Okay, so then here's another example. Si escuchamos las palabras antiguas, okay, yes, we hear the ancient words. Okay, so again, here's the ancient, or not the ancient, the classical Nahuatl version. Okay, as you can see, why? I don't know, they used the V, and the Spaniards had reasons for using this, but obviously doesn't make too much sense, right? And so almost actually added an H, which is good, because that's the only way to know that it's escuchamos, like it is, you know, us doing it, not just one. Because this right here, tikaki, okay, this is actually singular because there's no glottal stop at the end, and so that H is very, very important. But as you can see, if you try to read classical Nahuatl, why would there be a V, right? We'll represent that. We'll probably read it as Kema, Tikaki, Veu Tlatoli, right? So very difficult to pronounce. Again, classical Nahuatl is not the gold standard that everybody thinks it is, right? It's very poorly written, and it's very difficult to decipher. And then you've got Rincon. Look at this. He went over, and Carochi también. They went over and they added all the long vowels. They added this little symbol facing upward. This is the glottal stop. Okay. There's two glottal stops in Nahuatl, by the way. Okay. There's this one, which is very subtle. Okay. And the ones that come in between are a little bit more stressed. Okay. And so you can see how it changes, and I'll go ahead and just read this one since it's the Anali modern version that we're all kind of mostly familiar with. So we have Kema, Tikaki, Wewech, Tlahtoli. You hear that? You hear the H there, right? So the H here is a little more slightly pronounced. So Kema, Tikaki, Wewech, Tlahtoli. Okay, so you got to really emphasize that glottal stop when you're speaking. And here's another example. Cuando estamos enfermos, no comemos. Okay, when we are sick, we do not eat. So this is the Nahuatl version. Look at this. Why? Why? Oh my God. So they put a Y there, and then, you know, there's actually no U sound. There's no U sound ever in class and Nahuatl ever, you know. And so to say, you know, a lot of people who don't know classical Nahuatl, they'll say, oh, this is Ikuak, right? That's what it looks like. So that's not how it's pronounced, though. It's actually Ikuak, okay? And so a lot of, you know, if you have a C, it could be an S, or it could be a K. There's so many rules that you have to remember when you're reading classical Nahuatl to even remember that. It's just a big pain, right? And so this makes it completely clear where we're stressing. You know, if it has the glottal stop at the end, the H at the end, we're talking about plural because it's estamos, okay? Estamos. So cuando ihkuak, cuando, estamos, titokokoa, right? Amo, so amo, titlaqua, right? And so this is very good, and this one as well, they're very good for spoken Nahuatl. And then of course you have the example with the another V here, right? And then a Y in between. And then this, look at this. I mean, what is that? Right? Ya no puedo recordar lo que dijo. Okay, so I can no longer remember what he told us, right? And so look, if we go here, so we have ayok, well, nikil, namiki, tlain, oki, to. Okay, and so just to summarize as a chronology of written Nahuatl, we can see that here, this is a really critical point. Without Rincon and Carochi documenting all of those, a lot of that information might be lost. But of course, there's also the modern Nahuatl speakers that can help us fill in the blanks, right? And that's the work that Cartooten did there. And so very, very important work. But just to summarize again, this idea that Classical Nahuatl is the best and everything else is devolved from that is a very, very terrible, terrible idea. It's degrading to modern Nahuatl speakers, right? And it really pisses them off. So let's try to be a little bit more compassionate, and also come to the understanding that Classical Nahuatl is not even that great, right? Like it's not even written very well, and it uses very weird orthography. There's letters that they're very hard to figure out what they are, and there's just so many rules that you have to learn in order to even attempt to speak this. Okay, and so this is a lot easier, especially for Nahuatl learners, right? And so let's remember that, because it's not, in Spanish they say, oh, they're all dialects, right? It's not that. They're not dialects. It's the Nahuatl language is a language with variants, just like English or Spanish, right? If you go to Spain, there's going to be a lot of words that the Spaniards will not understand if you speak Mexican Spanish, right? Because they use different words for things. Mexican Spanish has a lot of Nahuatl. Spanish from Spain does not. And so it doesn't mean that they're different languages though, right? They're the same language, they're just variants. And same thing with Nahuatl, okay? So all of the variants are equally valid. None is less than any other, especially not the Classical Nahuatl. And the Classical Nahuatl is just a snapshot of one very small group of people. And we have to remember that at that time, even when it was written, there was still a lot of variation, in all the places that Nahuatl was spoken. So it was not like this was the right way and everybody else was wrong. No, that's not the case. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and I hope you have a deeper understanding of the relation between Classical Nahuatl and modern varieties as well. Okay, I'll see you next time. Piali, Timoitase.